Thank you, everyone. Thank you for having me here to Northern tonight. I'm really looking forward to it, and I think tonight is a very important topic. And that's, if there's one thing that you take home tonight, it's to realise that the shield of faith is a really, really important topic. Now, one of the reasons why we know that is in that little note that you would probably all have, which was fantastic. Thank you, committee, whoever did that. I encourage you to read it. It's got some fantastic little points about the shield of faith. Welcome, Smiths. And I'm really glad that when Steve asked me to give a Northern talk, that the shield of faith was still left. By the time I'd replied, I think 5 speakers already got in, and for some reason they didn't choose the shield of faith. And the reason why I thought they would is because, as we read in Ephesians 6, it says, above all, take on the shield of faith. And tonight, what we really want to understand is we want to understand more about the shield of faith. What's the shield of faith? How does it help us? What does this look like in our life? But also, why does Paul say, above all, take on the shield of faith? What is he saying here? And that's what we want to get to tonight. Because you can read it and say, above all, okay, that makes sense. But does that mean that this shield of faith is more important than the breastplate of righteousness? Does this mean the shield of faith is more important than truth and all these things? And then in Ephesians 6, where it talks about the spiritual warrior, Paul says, take on the whole armour of God. So what does Paul say, take on the whole armour of God? And then he says, and there's one thing that's more important than the rest. So we're going to answer these questions tonight. We're going to go through and really understand more about the shield of faith and why Paul says, above all, take on the shield of faith. And how we're going to get there tonight is by looking at Abraham. Then we're going to look at toolboxes. Then we're going to look at battle tactics. And then we're going to look at anchors. Now, there is a method to the madness. It may not seem particularly logical that that's how we're going to answer the question. But these are all spiritual themes, and we're going to unlock them tonight. And this is how we're going to do it, to go through these 4 steps. Okay. But first of all, does anyone know where is the first occurrence of the word shield in the Bible? This is where I'm looking for audience participation. Where's the first occurrence of the word shield in the Bible? You can guess. Oh. If it's there, my answer is wrong. Genesis 15, yes. Can everyone turn to Genesis 15, please? So we have shield in Genesis 15 and verse 1. And we're going to spend some time in Genesis 15 because, as is always the case, whenever you're looking at a biblical theme, always go to the first time it's mentioned and look at the context. Look at what it's talking about, look at the context, and you probably get about 75% of what the rest of the occurrences of that word are going to be talking about. And most of the time it occurs in Genesis. Genesis is the seabed of the Bible. So we're going to spend some time in Genesis 15 understanding what this shield is and understanding how it relates to Ephesians 6. So we're going to look at Genesis 15 and what does it tell us about shields. Now let's read Genesis 15 and verse 1, where it says, after these things, the word of Yahweh came unto Abram in a vision. After these things. What are the things that Genesis 15 is after another question. What's happened in Genesis 14, for example? Yes, Abraham's rescued Lot. What else has happened in Genesis 14? Melchizedek meets Abraham. Yep, absolutely. What else has happened? A bunch of wars. With who? The King of Nations? Yeah. Yep. So there's a bunch of stuff happening in Genesis 14. We have Abram who has humiliated a world power. We see that in verse 17. And what he's also done as he meets Melchizedek is he's publicly insulted the king of Sodom. We can see that in verse 23. So all these things have happened in Genesis 14. Abraham, full of faith and the power of God, has gone out and he's taken on a world leader. And in Genesis 15 verse 1 it says, "After these things Yahweh appeared to Abram in a vision and said," what? He said, "Fear not." Now God's only going to say that if Abraham was fearing. And that makes sense in the context of Genesis 14, doesn't it? Now the cold light of day, after taking on this world power, after he has humiliated the king of Sodom, who's not very far from him, he's fearful. And God is saying, "Fear not." So that's the context of Genesis 15, and that's how Genesis 15 opens. Fear not, Abram. Don't be afraid. I am your shield. So I'm the person who is going to protect you from your powerful enemies and your exceeding great reward. I'm still going to give you an heir. And this is really what Genesis 15 is about. So if you want to do some Bible marking, which I highly recommend, in Genesis 15, verse 2 to 7, is the exceeding great reward. This is how God will give Abram an heir. That's verse 2 to 7. And then in verse 8 to 21 is how God will protect Abram and his seed. And this is talking about that shield. So Genesis 15 verse 1 holds for us really the microcosm of what we have in the rest of Genesis 15. We have how God is going to be a shield to Abram and his seed, and how he's going to be an exceeding great reward. And that's how Genesis 15 is broken up. It's these two separate parts about a reward and about how God is going to be a shield. Okay, so God is a shield. He said he's going to be a shield to Abram. Let's stay in Genesis 15 and see if there's anything else we can learn from verse 8 to 21 about God as a shield. And as we go on in Genesis 15, in verse 9 we have this very unusual section. So this is something that I know when I was in Northern, whenever I'd read Genesis 15, I'd have no idea what it was talking about. It's these pictures of animals and birds and this vision. So we're going to dig into it. We're going to go slow, going to ask questions, but it's going to be important for the rest of the talk. And what we have in verse 9 of Genesis 15 is we have a heifer, we have a she-goat and a ram, we have a turtle dove and a young pigeon. Now what's important to note is that a heifer here in Genesis 15, this is a cow prior to being called a cow. Okay? And then with the she-goat and the ram, with their age, this is prime breeding age. With the turtle dove, this is migratory and it's synonymous with spring. And the young pigeon, this is a pigeon that's just been born. So what we have in Genesis 15 in verse 9 is we've actually got symbols of fertility. We've got these animals that speak of fertility. And these animals are going to be representative of what? What are these animals representative of in Genesis 15? Any ideas? These are very fruitful animals. What are they representative of? Abraham's seed, yes. Why do you say that?
Because if they are fruitful and they're going to multiply, exactly what God did promise Abraham, his seed will be fruitful and multiply.
Absolutely. So God has just promised Abram that he's going to have a very fruitful seed. And now, in Genesis 15, we have all these animals which are speaking of fertility and fruitfulness, and they're going to represent Abram's seed. Okay, that's going to become important as we go through. And then what happens in verse 10 is Abram is asked, apologies females, down the front. I'll move on from there or black it out. There we go. Oh, there's another one. This is what we have in Genesis 15. Abram is asked to cut these animals into pieces. And in verse 10, he cuts them in pieces, and now they're not good for anything. They're not good for eating. They're not good for sacrifice. In fact, as we can see in verse 11, they're called carcasses. And then in verse 11, we see that Abraham protects these carcasses from the birds that we have there. So Abram is there. He is protecting these carcasses. He is being a shield, yes. Yeah, he's been a shield. Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly right, Kit. So here, Abram is being a shield to this representation of the seed of Abraham. He's driving the birds away. Now, so we said that these fruitful animals are representative of Abram's seed. Now that they're carcasses and cut in pieces, what do you think that's a picture of? How does that relate to Abram's seed? Dispersed? Yep. 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 Keep on going. Someone else can. Yeah, I suppose. Kit? It's useless, absolutely. Abram's seed is now useless. Now, this is a picture of when Abram's seed go to Egypt and they're taken into slavery. And we know that because of the context of Genesis 15. God's actually going to explain a lot of this vision for us. And if you read further on in Genesis 15, it talks about how this multitudinous seed is going to be in captivity in Egypt. And it's essentially going to be in a spot where how is God going to bring anything out of this seed? It's there under the rule of Pharaoh in Egypt, and now it's become useless. Okay, now, when we move on, Abram as the shield doesn't last very long, does he? So when we move on in verse 12, now Abram as the shield, well, he's unable to drive these birds away. Now he's in this darkness and in this terror, this nightmare. And the point here for Abram, the point here for us as well, is that now that Abram's gone, now that shield has gone, who's going to drive the birds away? Who's going to protect the seed of Abram? Who's going to take that job? And this is linked to verse 15. God is just making the point to Abram again. Abram, actually, one day you're going to die. You're going to go to the grave in a good old age. So what's going to happen to your seed? And the message of God in the rest of Genesis 15, and as we can see there in verse 14, etc., is even though you're going to go to the grave in a good old age, don't worry. I am going to protect your seed when you're dead. And that's the point that God is making in Genesis 15. I'm going to be the shield. And then as we come to the end of Genesis 15, we have another very unusual scene. So in verse 17, with Abram still in a deep sleep, this smoking furnace and burning lamp moves between the pieces. Now, what's this about? What is God trying to say here with this furnace and lamp moving between the pieces when Abram is dead? Any thoughts? Kit again. Yep. God protecting Abram's seed when Abram's unable to. Absolutely. Yep. And there's one other thing that this is pointing forward to as well. Does anyone know what that is? Absolutely. Absolutely. Yep. And one other thing too. Does anyone know what it means to pass between the pieces? Has anyone heard of that phrase before? No. No? So passing between the pieces is a phrase that's used in the Old Testament, and this is an Old Testament custom, where when two people make a covenant, the person who is signing up and saying, yes, I'm going to do this and this and this, they walk between the pieces of usually a cow, and that's how they essentially sign the covenant. So nowadays we have an e-signature and you sign the contract. In the Old Testament days, they would cut up a cow and walk between it, and that was them saying, yep, I'm signing up to that contract. So they didn't do that every single time, I'm sure, but for really, really important contracts or covenants, that's what they'll do. So this is covenant language. And this is a representation, it's the manifestation of God walking between the pieces. This is about God making a covenant, and we know about that because that's what exactly God says from verse 18 to 21. So verse 18 to 21 is the covenant that God is signing up to, in effect, by passing between the pieces. And the covenant he's making in verse 18 to 21 is, I'm going to be with your seed, Abram. You're going to be dead, you're going to go to the grave in a good old age, and hundreds of years later, I'm still going to be with your seed, and I'm going to bring them into the land. I'm going to protect them. They're going to go through captivity in Egypt, but I'm going to be their shield, and I'm going to protect them. And God here signs up to this covenant. So, what does Genesis 15 tell us about the shield of faith? What have you learnt so far from Genesis 15 which might be useful when we're learning about the shield of faith? Question. Yep, absolutely. And that's going to come out really strongly in the next point. Yep. Kit again. Yep. God's going to do the full protection. Yep, absolutely. Anything else? Yes. Yep. Yep. Absolutely. So we've already got these themes of faith coming out in Genesis 15. I mean, Genesis 15 is one of those classic chapters of faith. Romans 4 talks all about Genesis 15 and about the faith that Abram showed here. So we've already got this shield, we've already got these themes of faith coming out in Genesis 15. We've got all these characteristics coming out. So God says in Genesis 15, I'm going to be a shield, And then to make it even doubly sure that he is the shield, he makes this covenant. And that's what Paul says in Hebrews 6 verse 17. I'm going to read from the ESV. So God's already said to Abram, I'm going to be a shield. And then to make it really, really obvious that he's really, really going to be a shield and he's really, really going to protect Abram's seed, he makes a covenant. And in Hebrews 6 verse 17, I'm going to read from the ESV. So when God desired, and it's speaking of Genesis 15, it's speaking of this covenant that God makes to Abram. So when God desired to show more convincingly to the heirs of the promise the unchangeable character of his purpose, he guaranteed it with an oath. So in Genesis 15, we don't just have a shield, we've got a very, very, very strong shield. We've got God, and then we've got God making an oath saying he's going to do exactly what he said to Abram. So that's one thing we've got which we've talked about. And the other thing we've got which we talked about as well is God as a shield is going to be there even if we fail. God can still be a shield. Through highs and lows, God can be a shield. And in a fuller sense, the shield of faith doesn't just exist while we're alive, it can get passed on to others. And that's one of the lessons there. And then the other lesson which we talked about is that this is something that's been given to us. God said to Abram, I'm your shield. Abram didn't particularly ask for it. God saw there was a need and he said, Abram, I'm going to be your shield. And Abram believed in that. That's what Abram did. And then, of course, he had a whole bunch of actions of faith off the back of that. But he didn't have to create the shield. God said, I'm going to be your shield. And so these tools are provided. And with that in mind, let's go on to toolboxes. So let's go back to Ephesians 6. And notice in Ephesians 6 how it says, take, 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 take. It doesn't say build, it doesn't say create, it doesn't say make, it says take. And one of the amazing things we can take away from this is that at our disposal, we have things that are able to help us and protect us in any situation that we find ourselves in. We have the tools. God has created and given us the tools. And for 80%, probably even more, for all of you, you will know what these tools are. God has given us the tools to help us in any situation of life. We don't have to make them. We don't have to create them. We take them and we put them in our toolbox. Now, who's got a toolbox here? Do people have toolboxes nowadays? Oh, of course you do. Fantastic. We've got 3 people who've got toolboxes. Amazing. Now, the benefits of a toolbox, I've even got a toolbox. And I've got 3 screwdrivers in it, but I've got a toolbox. They're an incredibly helpful thing to have. And for people who use toolboxes all the time, they're essential. Because when you go to a job, whatever that is, I worked with lifts recently, you take a toolbox and you come up with a situation in the lift and you've got a tool for it. You come up with another situation, you've got a tool for it. And all you do is you reach in and grab a tool. And that helps you fix the situation. This is kind of what we're getting in Ephesians 6. Not quite, but it's kind of that idea of taking on the breastplate of righteousness, taking on the shield of faith. Now, with those people who have got toolboxes, especially the more involved and complicated ones, if you ask me to, I don't know, get the crescent wrench or something like that, I'd have no idea what it is. I mean, you could even ask me to get the left-handed screwdriver and I'd probably still be searching for it for a while. And the reason for that is because I can have a toolbox, there can be tools inside it, but if I don't use them very often, I'm not experiencing them, they're not particularly useful. And the same can be said for the elements of the armour of God. I think the vast majority of us will know and be able to explain and probably have in our toolbox parts of the armour of God. But what we need to do is we need to be able to use them. We need to be able to implement them in daily life, and then that's where the power will come. The point is, in Ephesians 6, is all we ever need is here, right in the Bible. All we ever need is in Ephesians 6. We don't need to make it, but we need to use them. And what are the point of the tools in Ephesians 6? What is the main point of the tools in Ephesians 6? What are they going to help us to do? Question. There's one thing repeated over and over and again in Ephesians 6. What do these tools help us to do? To stand. To stand. Now, why is it important to stand? This is in the context of a spiritual warrior, and now we're going to be talking battle tactics. Why do you think Paul keeps on saying stand, stand, stand? He doesn't talk about particularly fighting, although he does infer it. What's the importance of standing in a battle? You ready? Absolutely. Yeah. What else? Yeah. Yeah. You're ready? You're not lying down? Yeah. You're committed. Yeah. Yeah. You have courage. Absolutely. I mean, I think it'll be incredibly fearful. I would be fearful in a battle. It would take quite a bit of courage when people are running towards you to stand. Yeah. One of the other reasons is in battles of this time, so we're talking Roman times, most of these battles only lasted for a few hours, actually. Most of them were decided, battles I'm talking about, not wars. Battles were decided in an afternoon. And for the vast majority of these, the side that lost the battle is the side that had some soldiers fall over, and then the opposing army could get in those gaps and rout the army. That's how most of these armies were decided. Who's going to be the first person to fall over? So that's why in Ephesians 6, where it says stand, that's really important, because if you stand, then you're not going to lose. If you fall over, that's when the enemy gets in and takes over. So there's some battle tactics coming out in Ephesians 6. Okay, now there's another battle tactic which we're going to look at tonight, which is really essential when we look at our subject. And that is, I just realised, you can tell I did this in AI, can't you? The picture. The pigeons down the bottom are turning into javelins and darts. That's very impressive pigeons. What did happen in ancient battles wasn't pigeons turning into arrows and darts. But what would happen at the start of the battle to soften the other side up is there would usually be a volley of javelins or arrows or darts. And this is where we get into where we really try and understand why does Paul say, above all, take the shield of faith? And one of the reasons is because if you came to a battle and the enemy was far away, one of the first things that happens, as we've said, is these arrows come towards you. If you didn't have a shield, you didn't even get past first base. You're kind of stuck. If you didn't have a shield, something to protect you from these missiles coming towards you at the start of the battle, you can't even get off first base. And that's one of the reasons why the shield of faith is so important. That's why it's above all. It's first, because it's probably going to be the thing that you're going to use the first, is the shield. And this shield of faith is important at the start, and it's important at the end as well. So this shield is incredibly important. And in ancient warfare, the shield was essential for you to be able to get past that first engagement. You would need it right from the start. And these darts, these arrows would fly at you, and if you didn't have the shield, well, then you're going to be injured at the very best from the start of the engagement. And standing is going to be really tricky if you've got lots of arrows in your legs, for example. So the shield of faith, the shield is really, really important. It's something that you need at the start and at the end as well. Okay, so the shield of faith is able to protect us from the fiery darts of the wicked. And these fiery darts are things that are from a distance, obviously. So the shield is there to protect us from things from a distance. The sword of the Spirit is there to help us in close combat. We've got these different elements of the spiritual warrior, but the shield is there really for these things that come from a distance, as opposed to the sword of the Spirit, which helps us in close combat. And this shield of faith helps us. So if we're starting to think now about what is the analogy that Paul is making in Ephesians 6, what might be these fiery darts of the wicked? So these things from afar, which we're needing the shield of faith to protect us from. What might these things be? Yep. I mean, that is the answer. Absolutely. What could it be in 2025? What could those things be specifically in 2025? What are these things that come to us from afar? Yep. So political agendas? Yep. Absolutely. What else could it be? Yep. So ways of thinking. Yeah. So these are getting sniped at us from, it could be the other side of the world. Yep. What else? Yep. So these are all, the fiery darts of the wicked are all influences. Things that try to influence us from afar. A way of thinking. And it's in what we read, it's in what we see, it's in what we hear, it's everywhere. And it starts from day dot. It starts almost from minus day one. These influences are constantly there, getting thrown and sniped at us. And they're there, the purpose of them is to make us fall, to make us not stand, and not fight. So these are the types of things that the shield of faith is able to protect us from. Okay, so how does that work? So we've got these fiery darts of the wicked. We're saying these are words, ideas, thoughts, influences from afar that we can be affected by, impacted by. And then we've got this shield of faith. We've looked in Genesis 15 in terms of what a shield is. God is a shield. So what might this shield of faith specifically be? What might Paul be talking about here with the shield of faith? We've looked at a bunch of different ideas. What is the thing, do you think, that Paul is saying that is above everything else going to protect us from those fiery darts of the wicked? What is the shield of faith? Any thoughts? Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Do you have a proof for that? Yeah. Faith. Yeah. And there's two parts of faith. Faith is believing that God is, and that he's a rewarder of them that diligently seek him. Basically, you trust that God, whatever God says is true. So when we talk about the shield of faith, faith in what? Well, it's the same faith that Abram had in Genesis 15. It's the same faith that all those of faith had in Hebrews 11. It's that faith that God said something and he means it, and I can 100% put trust in the fact that God will do it. Now that might seem really obvious and really easy. But these fiery darts of the wicked are there to undermine our confidence in the fact of what God has said. That's absolutely their intention. And you'll probably feel that. You probably know about that. There are things, there are words, there are ideas, influences which are sniped at us every day, and their intention is to undermine our trust in God. Do you really believe in God? If God said this, God said he has power over sin. Do you really believe that he will do that? God will raise the dead. Do you really believe that God will raise the dead? God said this. God said that. The Jews are God's people. Christ is coming back to the earth. Do you really think that God's saying that? And the shield of faith, that faith and that trust that God, whatever God says is true, that's the thing above everything else that is going to protect us from those fiery darts of the wicked, those influences, those words that are sniped at us each and every day. So now we get on to anchors, our last thing. This is a personal recommendation, especially something that's I found really, really helpful when I was about your age. One of my Sunday school teachers said this to us, who were a bunch of boys, about 15, 16. And he said, make anchors in your life. Things that you can go back to that will convince you that God is true. That what God said, he will do. And these are different things for different people. For me, it was some prophecies, some things that the Bible says. But what I recommend each and every one of you to do is to start to look for anchors in your life. These are things that you'll know to be true, that will hold you there when everything else seems shaky, when it's stormy. Don't have to think about it now, but I would encourage you to think about what these things are. This can be prophecy. This can be the wonders of creation, the complexity of nature. This can be God's work in Israel. This can be some quotes in the Bible which are just beautiful and can only be said by God. These types of things. Look out for anchors in your life. And when you find them, grab hold of them and don't ever let them go. These are things that make up the shield of faith. Anchors in your life that show to you that God is true. And you'll find them in the Word. So why is it above all that we take on the shield of faith? Well, read this. It's got some really good thoughts as to why above all. And one of the things that it says in here is faith is the foundation. As we talked about, the shield is used at the start and the end of the battle. It's used the whole way through. It's essential the whole way through. And if you don't have a shield, you're going to be hindered in that battle. It's going to be a whole stack easier for the enemy to make you fall. It's going to be really, really hard to stand. So above all, take on the shield of faith. Thank you.